Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to be looking at how the financial markets that we have here in the United States, how those have evolved over time to give us the modern system that we have today. So this area is actually a little bit more history than numeric. And interestingly enough, it's actually aligned with some of the research I'm doing now, hopefully for not very long, but I was asked to do this very short kind of project for the Manoa campus on some of the history of the capital markets, um, along with the Civil War. Admittedly, I don't know much about the Civil War. I mean, I know the North won, and stuff like that, but I don't know much more beyond that. But I'm actually learning quite a bit now, especially about um, the South's approach to financing this very expensive war versus the North, and how they each required a financial system or lacked a financial system to carry it out. And I kept thinking back to that as I was reviewing over this chapter. So the economic and financial system that we see today all started to emerge actually after the Civil War and really in the early 1900s. And what you see in the late 1800s, especially around the Civil War, is the emergence of the industrial era, where you have big capital intensive systems that are getting off the ground, like the railroad, like a wireless telegraph system, um, like a distribution network for products being built in the north and taken elsewhere. And you see this evolution also of American business, where you start to get bigger and bigger businesses because they need the capital to build out these investments. So you see that in railroads, you see that in steel, you see that with AT&T as a telephone company. And so you see all these trusts, these monopolies building. And then you start to see this emergence of a modern workforce where the workers themselves are given very scientific tasks in order to carry out the job that they're doing. But all of this changes quite suddenly in 1907. So 1907 becomes a very important date because during the Civil War, 1863, all the way to 1913, the U.S. did not have a central bank. 1913, you actually get the Federal Reserve created. So without a central bank, basically all of the commercial banks were local. There was a national currency, but everything was regulated on the state level. And what you would see is that the banks did not have a consistent regulatory structure, so they were lending way too much and to riskier prospects than they thought. And it led to a financial panic in 1907, a panic that was so severe that only one of the richest people in the United States, James Pierpont Morgan, was able to end that panic in 1907. The president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, was so disturbed by the fact that it took this very rich person to basically save the American economy that he realized we needed a counterforce. We needed something other than a rich person to bail out the United States. We needed a Federal Reserve Bank, a central bank. So the most important thing that this Federal Reserve was going to do And the important feature that it filled was that it was the lender of last resort. We certainly saw that role emerge as important during the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, but we also saw it as important during COVID. Um, Essentially, it does, as the Federal Reserve exists, and again, in full disclosure, I used to work for the Federal Reserve, so just keep that in the back of your mind. Not being like strong proponent of them, but dude, they used to pay my wages, so there's got to be some extent to which I give them some love. But most economists give them love, so it's not just unique to me. Um, the Federal Reserve does do some tasks for the government. It is the government's bank, essentially. But the most important thing it does is it's there for the banks, and it creates trust among the banking public that there is a stopgap, that there is something that will back those banks in what they do. The commercial banks that are in all of the states, they buy shares of ownership in that Federal Reserve Bank. They continue to. They did in the beginning, and they continue to. And the structure of the Federal Reserve. So the concern was, if you have a central bank, that's not going to be representative of the whole country. At least that was the concern back in 1912, 1913. So what they did is they wanted to create regions, and these regions, let's go to them. If you had me for principles, you know that we look at this, but let's just pick the Wikipedia entry. So when this was written in 1912, the map looked where everyone lived was very different, right? Because if you notice, there's not a lot going on in Sector 4 and Region 4 anymore. I used to work for Region 7. Even Region 7 didn't have a lot going on. But then look at Region 12, which we're part of. Region 12 covers such a vast territory. Even quite honestly, even something like Region 5 covers a vast territory, whereas Region 3 covers very little. So the economic activity has been such that it has moved west since 1912. Because what each of these regional banks do, one of their important tasks, at least when I worked there in the early 2000s, was check clearing. Each district actually had several check processing facilities. Today in the United States, there's only one check processing facility, and that's in the Atlanta, Georgia district, District 6. But I know, for instance, in Region 7, we had a check processing facility in Peoria, we had one in Detroit, we had one in Milwaukee, and I think we had one in Des Moines, as well as Chicago. So we had several check processing facilities. We made 87 cents for each check processed, and that provided the bulk of the revenue for the Federal Reserve Bank. We're a different society today. We don't write as many checks, so the financing of the Federal Reserve is very different today. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, does set the monetary policy. The regions basically inform the board of governors of the Federal Reserve of what's going on in that region by contributing to the Beige Book. So it's not that each of the district banks are going to set their own interest rates or lending policies. That was kind of one of the early proposals. That didn't happen. Now you'll notice though too, New York City, New York, District 2, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, District 2 is an incredibly important branch. It's always on the Board of Governors, represented on the Board of Governors, and that's because its home, New York City, is the home to the bond markets and the equity markets, which are obviously very important. So usually being the chair of the New York branch is usually a sign that you're probably going to head to something more of national importance. 1923, we do get that open market committee, and that is where we then start to get that centralization of interest rate policies that we see today. So you do have this first 10 years where in the beginning they were, but by 1923, no longer. And you really do get a very, you get a centralized and strong central bank, courtesy of Benjamin Strong, of the Federal Reserve of New York. Now, this came at a good time because it all came before then the Great Depression. The Great Depression, which we largely attribute to over speculation in the stock market. And essentially, it's like GameStop, essentially, is that all these stock market prices kept rising. And eventually they started to fall. As they fell, margin calls were made. So people were buying on margin and people had to sell their shares, which caused the share prices to drop dramatically when those margin calls could not be met. And then once they start selling, then others have to start selling. And that's when you get panic selling setting in. And when we look at what happened during the Great Depression, unfortunately, the Federal Reserve Bank did not do good work. It did not do what it should have done. But at the time, granted, the field of macroeconomics was quite young. Remember, John Maynard Keynes does not write his influential theory of money and interest until the early 1930s. So really, the central bank didn't see itself even as having much of a role in eliminating the Great Depression. And it certainly didn't do anything to help it. The neither the federal government nor the central bank did anything to really correct for it. Now, the one thing I'm learning as I do my research on the Civil War is, when we think of a war, we do tend to think of like strategies and tactics and people being brave and fighting a common enemy. But really, the financing of that war, the ability of a side to finance the war really becomes critical to winning the war. And in the United States, for instance, we financed the war either by borrowing money or by um, printing more cash, but primarily by issuing lots and lots of bonds. We had the bond drives. Now, the government needed this money, did these bond drives so that they could pay for the productive capacity. 500 airplanes a day, that seems like a lot of stuff to produce. We have the Lend-Lease Act, which was the idea that we will lend our military equipment to the British and they'll give it back to us when the war is over. Well, they didn't say very much about it all being all broken after the war, but that is what it was. And we became a net exporter. We exported a great deal of goods. But the government during the war also, it really took control of both the production markets because everything was then oriented towards the military, but they also did take control of the capital markets. The bond markets, the bond drives, sucked up all of the available cash. The ability of any individual to borrow money was basically gone because any money that could be lent was lent to the government, which then becomes part of what John Maynard Keynes talks about, right? John Maynard Keynes, he authors a pretty important text, How to Pay for the War. And basically, you pay for it by borrowing from your strong public and financial system. You have to do some taxation, right? And they did that during the Civil War. They did that during World War One, and that's how you get the authorization for the income tax system during the Civil War, and then it's put into the Constitution with World War One. World War II taxes get even higher. Most of the government's budget oriented towards paying for the war, but they're running a deficit. The government is running a deficit, and it's managing that deficit through its Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve Bank is buying those bonds largely. And then the public is buying bonds as well through the various bond drives. If the government has these huge deficits and they're printing lots of bonds, the concern always is going to be that there's going to be inflation. During the Civil War, so think of it this way, and again, I'm sorry with all these Civil War examples, but it's the one I know the best right now. So if we think of any challenge for a governmental system, they can do three things. They can either print the cash to pay their bills, they can levy taxes to collect money to pay the bills, or they can borrow to pay the bills. Again, I'm using the Civil War as my example. In the Civil War, the South did this. They printed cash. And the result of that was that they had 9,000% inflation. The North did it a little bit, but they only had 80% inflation. But I mean, some people would say this is what, right? Regardless of what you think about the Civil War, and I'm not trying to say there should be a diversity of opinion about who should have won the war, but let's be generous here and say you can have a diversity of opinions about who should have won the Civil War. The South lost in part because that high of inflation just destroys the society. Everything goes black market. The culture is destroyed by that. The North borrowed. And the North basically did bond drives. People subscribed to bonds. People spent all their money on bonds, such that nearly 50% of the war was financed by the North issuing bonds. The South was not able to issue as many bonds, except they were able to issue a really interesting bond. I'm not sure if I'm spelling this right. They were able to issue something called the Erlanger bond, which is what they sold to Europeans because they thought the Europeans would give them money for cotton. And so they issued bonds that were payable in redeemable in cotton. The big thing that was there. Okay, let's go back to here. So to control inflation during the war, what the government did is it imposed price controls. Those price controls then basically limited what could be charged for certain items, and it basically controlled inflation. There were also rations. Individual households only got allotted a certain amount. And then you had wage controls, but then also too, you had this constant campaign that people were discouraged from spending money and borrowing and just to put all of their money into war bonds. Now, when everyone comes back from the war, World War II, now everyone's got all this money, right? Everyone's got all this money from the bonds that they had put in during the war. People are coming back from the war and are like, damn, I'm happy to be alive, right? And so everyone's like, buy a house, have kids, right? Everyone's getting married. The banks out there are lending as much money as they can, and they're helped by the fact that the federal government then has Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the VA, right? And so the government is encouraging people to buy houses, encouraging people to borrow money. And the financial system grows dramatically after World War II to accommodate this huge influx of money. Now, in Europe, we have a little bit more of a problem. I mean, there has been this push to create an integrated, European Union for some time, and certainly picked up during the 1980s. But you did have this kind of split between countries that were in the West that were more market-based and those in the East that were more centrally planned. With the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 1990s, right, both the fall of Eastern European countries, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, if I'm not mistaken, then you really start to get to work on starting to unite all of the countries and to create the European Union that we know today, such that by the year 2001, you've got the common currency, the euro. Now, but again, this doesn't happen after World War II. So really at that point, then you've got individual countries of Europe, each with their own financial and economic system. And then you've got the United States that's really just pushing far ahead. Now, the problems start to happen in the 1970s. The 1970s was a very bad economic time period because what happened in the 1970s is a problem that's actually still vexing economists what caused it. But we had stagflation, both stagnant economic growth and high inflation, and high inflation. Stagnant economic growth meant that we had high unemployment. So you had high unemployment, high inflation. And the question is really, why did that happen? The best, in terms of why the economy was stagnant, there's this general belief that there was a productivity slowdown, that workers became less productive. And as for inflation, there's a lot of things we can think of. I think they're being a little bit generous here by saying higher labor costs caused higher market prices. I don't personally subscribe to that belief. So in this case, they're saying here, workers became less productive for some reason. Well, I'll tell you what I think is the most extreme view. And it's a little bit more conservative. The most extreme view is that rising environmental regulations in the early 1970s forced businesses to produce things in a less efficient manner, but more environmentally conscious manner. And because there was more labor costs now involved in each production item, then the items had to have a higher cost. Thus, you see the inflation. The other belief out there is that you can still have that productivity slowdown for some reason. But that the other thing out there is that during the 1960s, we had lots of huge government expenditures going on in three big areas. We had, we were sending someone to the moon. We were fighting a war on poverty, right? The Johnson administration in 1966 and 1967 started to create Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, all of these public welfare programs that we have around us today, public housing, Head Start. And we were fighting a war in Vietnam. Three very expensive things that the Johnson administration and later the Nixon administration realized we could only pay for by printing more cash. And so the one theory out there, which has actually gained some traction, there seems to be some proof of it, is that Nixon wanted to get reelected in 1972. And so to get reelected in 1972, he told his Federal Reserve chairman that he wanted there to be a more accommodative monetary policy. He wanted an increase in cash. And so to make the economy seem better in 1972. And so the Federal Reserve chairman printed more cash, made the economy better in 1972. Then you saw incredibly high inflation after that. And so what you get here is this. Sorry, I'm just one typing thing here. So then you get to this belief by the late 1970s that what you really needed to do was that you needed to have somehow control for this all. So among the individuals that are considered accommodative of what Nixon wanted, that would be the incredibly conservative Arthur Burns. So Arthur Burns was friends with the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, I think he was from University of Chicago. And so he wanted Nixon to win politically. But it took then someone like Paul Volcker, who just recently passed away, nominated by Jimmy Carter, to then say, the only way we can control this inflation is by dramatically reducing the money supply. Let's see here what the percent was. Yeah. Interest rates in October 1979 were raised to 20%. Imagine that. 20% interest rates. I mean, that's just insane if you thought about it today. He dramatically, by raising the interest rate to 20%, he dramatically reduced the money supply. And that was the only way you could fix the rampant inflation. And quite honestly, that right there, 1979, is the last time the United States experienced dramatically high inflation. Most people, certainly of your age group, have forgotten it. I was only 2 years old. I have a very vague memory of the bad inflation that existed at that time, but nothing else. Now, Jimmy Carter loses the 1980 election largely because, dude, that really sucks if you're trying to work and now the inflation rate or the interest rate is now over 20%. So, there is a lot of politics too in this discussion of. So Paul Volcker takes over August 6th. By October, he's making the interest rate over 20%. Now, thing is, Paul Volcker is independent of Jimmy Carter. It's unknown whether Jimmy Carter really wanted that to be the case or not, but Paul Volcker gets to decide it. So 81 to 82, you really do get the worst recession since the Great Depression. It was as worse as the COVID recession that we just are finishing experiencing. It does reduce the inflation dramatically, but it kills the economy as much as it can. But by 1982, the inflation is largely done with and the economy can then start recovering. Now, it's complicated by the fact that we actually have another financial system crisis in the 1980s, and that's the savings and loan crisis. So, savings and loans were forced to pay certain interest rates to their deposit holders that were determined by regulations, in this case, Regulation Q. So they were determining the interest rates that were being paid, but they were starting to lose money to the money market funds that were starting to emerge. As these money market funds start to emerge and the savings and loans loses their deposits, then they're unable to compete effectively against these unregulated money market funds. And so to keep in business, they start lending in housing in a riskier and riskier way. One of those savings loans that was here that actually failed was what would eventually become American Savings Bank here in Hawaii. You get in the 1980s too this continual maturation of the financial market. You get these leveraged buyouts, these LBOs. That's kind of like Wall Street, like the first time it was done, right, where those people were trying to buy out like an airline. You use the assets as collateral to reissue the debt, um, to buy the stock in the company. You leverage the company. It's a leveraged buyout. Um, you get these junk bonds. Some of these things still exist today. If you look at things like Sears or Kmart or dying stores, Circuit City stores that have died, J.C. Penney, they all follow these kinds of just impose, or even a store today like Neiman Marcus, where you just flood those companies with debt, and then the company goes bankrupt, and then you reissue the stock. And you see this as well, even with the tech bubble, which again is before many of you were born. But you then, under Alan Greenspan, you have all of these companies offering IPOs. I mean, I remember having like philosophy professors in college that were like talking about internet companies that they wanted to start. These were just new companies off the ground, only empowered with an idea, and there was money out there for them to do their thing. Most of those companies went to the wayside. But for them in that era, the time was speed. But by March of 2000, many of these companies failed as the liquidity started to dry up. Alan Greenspan, 1998, when Russia went bankrupt or nearly bankrupt. East Asia went bankrupt in 98 to 99. And then in the lead up to the year 2000, when everyone was scared that ATMs and whatnot weren't going to recognize the year 2000. So this is the time around when I worked at the Federal Reserve. Very quietly in March, the Federal Reserve started to reduce some of its money supply because they realized that the computers were not going to go wreak havoc in the year 2000. And so they started to withdraw some of the money supply. And it just caused this internet stock bubble to burst, causing a recession for about 6 months in the year 2000. And yeah, I mean, it was, a lot of companies did go under at that time. But it was rectified both for that and the 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center by Alan Greenspan, again flooding the market with more cash. So Alan Greenspan always met a problem by increasing the money supply. He did it in 98 with the Russian financial crisis. He did it with the savings and loan crisis. He did it with the with Russia. He did it with the East Asian financial crisis. He did it with the internet stock bubble. And so that leads us to 2005. I think it's 2005 when Ben Bernanke takes over as Federal Reserve Chairman. And he quickly realizes, as a student of the Great Depression, he had studied the Great Depression for his dissertation, that what was needed was getting a handle on the housing market in some bubble bursting. And that bubble did burst, it just burst too soon. And that was in 2008 with the housing crisis happening. And that ended up taking down a good deal of the financial market system. Which brings us to today. You almost need the third edition of this book to talk about the current crisis, but quite honestly, we don't know what the current crisis all looks like.